Part 2 of Chapter 9. Evidence from 3 other doctors further confirmed this testimony, including a Dr. Bernard Bryant, who testified that Myers told him he did not commit the crime and that at the time he was incarcerated for the crime, he was threatened and harassed by the local police authorities into confessing he committed a crime. We emphasize to the court that all of these statements were made by Myers before the initial trial. Not only did these statements boost the credibility of Myers' recantation, but they had also been documented in medical records that by law should have been turned over to Walter's trial lawyers. The state's supporters and victims' family seemed confused by the evidence we were presenting. It complicated the simple narrative they had embraced about Walter's guilt and the need for swift and harsh punishment. We had maintained a good pace, and the cross-examinations had been shorter than I had expected. By the end of that second day, I felt very hopeful. I was tired, but feeling pleased as I walked to my car that evening. To my surprise, I noticed Miss Williams, the older woman from that morning, sitting outside the courthouse on a bench alone. She stood when our eyes met. I walked over, remembering how unsettled I had been to see her flee from the courtroom earlier. Miss Williams, I'm so sorry they did what they did this morning. They should have not done it, and I'm sorry if they upset you. But so you know, things went well today. I feel like we had a good day. Attorney Stevenson, I feel so bad. I feel so bad, she said, and grabbed my hands. I should have come into that courtroom this morning. She began to weep. Miss Williams, it's all right, I said. They shouldn't have done what they did. Please don't worry about it. I put my arm around her and gave her a big hug. No, Attorney Stevenson. I was meant to be in that courtroom. I was supposed to be in that courtroom. It's okay, Miss Williams. It's okay. No, sir, I wanted to be there. I tried. Lord knows I tried, Mr. Stevenson. But when I saw that dog, she shook her head and stared away with a distant look. When I saw that dog, I thought about 1965 when we gathered at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma and tried to march for our voting rights. They beat us and put those dogs on us. She looked back to me sadly. I tried to move, Attorney Stevenson. I wanted to move, but I just couldn't do it. As she spoke, it seemed like a world of sadness surrounded her. She let go of my hand and walked away. I watched her get into a car with some other people I had seen in the courtroom earlier. I drove back to the motel in a more somber mood to start preparing for the last day of hearings. The next morning was the third and final day of the hearing. The metal detector and the dog were still there, but no deputy stood at the door to block Black people from entering. When I looked up at the courtroom door, there stood Mrs. Williams. She was once again dressed impeccably in her scarf and hat. I watched as the officers allowed her to move forward. She held her head up as she walked slowly through the metal detector, repeating over and over, I ain't scared of no dog. I ain't scared of no dog. It was impossible to look away. She made it through the detector and stared at the dog. Then, loud enough for everyone to hear, she belted out, I ain't scared of no dog. She moved past the dog and walked into the courtroom. Black folks who were already inside beamed with joy as she passed them. She sat down near the front of the courtroom and turned to me with a broad smile and announced, Attorney Stevenson, I'm here. Miss Williams, it's so good to see you here. Thank you for coming. The courtroom filled up and I started getting my papers together. They brought Walter into the courtroom, the signal that the hearing was about to begin. That's when I heard Miss Williams call my name. No, Attorney Stevenson, you didn't hear me. I said, I'm here. She spoke very loudly, and I was a little confused and embarrassed. I turned around and smiled at her. No, Miss Williams, I did hear you, and I'm so glad you're here. When I looked at her, though, it was as if she was in her own world. The courtroom was packed, and the bailiff brought the court to order as the judge walked in. Everyone rose, as is the custom. When the judge took the bench and sat down, everyone else in the courtroom sat down as well. There was an unusually long pause as we all waited for the judge to say something. I noticed people staring at something behind me, and that's when I turned around and saw that Miss Williams was still standing. The courtroom got very quiet. All eyes were on her. I tried to gesture to her that she should sit, but then she leaned her head back and shouted, "I'm here." People chuckled nervously as she took her seat, but when she looked at me, I saw tears in her eyes. In that moment, I felt something peculiar, a deep sense of recognition. I smiled now because I knew she was saying to the room, "I may be old, I may be poor, I may be black, but I'm here. I'm here because I've got this vision of justice that compels me to be a witness. I'm here because I'm supposed to be here. I'm here because you can't keep me away." I smiled at Miss Williams while she sat proudly. For the first time since I started working on the case, everything we were struggling to achieve finally seemed to make sense. It took me a moment to realize that the judge was calling my name, impatiently asking me to begin. The last day of hearings went well. 6 people who had been jailed or imprisoned with Ralph Myers testified that Ralph had told them he was being pressured to give false testimony against Walter McMillan. Their testimonials were consistent, and one explained that Myers had written letters saying he didn't even know Mr. McMillan. We saved the most powerful evidence for the end, the tapes of Thomas Tate, Simon Benson, and Larry Eichner interrogating Myers. On the tapes, Myers repeatedly told the police that he didn't know anything about the Morrison murder or Walter McMillan. The officers threatened Myers, and Myers resisted, framing an innocent man for murder. Not only did the recordings confirm Myers' recantation, they exposed the lie that Pearson had told the court, the jury, and Mr. McMillan's trial counsel that there were only 2 statements provided by Myers. In fact, Myers gave at least 6 additional statements to the police. They were all favorable to Walter McMillan, and none of them had been disclosed to Mr. McMillan's attorneys as was required. I called on Mr. McMillan's trial lawyers, Bruce Boynton and J.L. Chestnut, to testify about how much more they could have done to win an acquittal, a not guilty verdict, if the state had turned over the evidence it had suppressed. We finished the presentation in our evidence, and to our surprise, the state put on no rebuttal case. I didn't know what they could have presented to deny our evidence, but I'd assumed they were present. I had assumed they would present something. The judge seemed surprised too. He paused, and then he wanted the parties to submit written briefs arguing what ruling he should make. We had hoped for this, and I was relieved that the court would give us time to explain the significance of all the evidence in writing and assist him in preparing his order, an order I hoped would set Walter free. At the end of 3 days of intense litigation, Michael and I said our farewells to the family in the courtroom and left feeling exhausted but satisfied. Bay Minette, where the hearing took place, is about 30 minutes from the beautiful beaches on the Gulf of Mexico. We had started a tradition of bringing our staff down to the beach each September, and we'd fallen in love with the clear, spectacular waters of the Gulf. Dolphins would be spotted in the early mornings, playfully making their way through the water. I'd often thought we should move our office to right there on the water. It was Michael's idea to hit the beach after the hearing before heading back to Montgomery. I wasn't sure it was a good idea, but the day was warm and the coast was so close. I couldn't resist. It would soon be dusk, but the heat persisted. I stood at the water's edge, my head racing with everything that had transpired in court. I replayed what witnesses had said and worried about whether things had gone exactly right. I analyzed every detail in my mind, every possible misstep until I caught myself. It was over. There was no point in making myself crazy by overthinking it now. On the sandy shore, I watched the brilliant white pelicans gliding effortlessly over the still waters in search of food. Walter would be making his way back to Holman now, shackled in the back of the van again. I thought about his family and all the people who had come to court. They'd kept the faith through the 5 years that had passed since Walter was first arrested. I thought about Miss Williams. She had come up to me after the hearings and had given me a sweet kiss on the cheek. I told her how happy I was she'd come back to court. She looked at me playfully. Attorney Stevenson, you know I wasn't going to let these people keep me out. Her words had made me smile. Michael got out of the water looking worried. What did you see? I joked. Shark? Eel? Poisonous jellyfish? Stingray? Piranha? He was out of breath. They've threatened us, lied to us. There are people who have told us that some folks in the country are so unnerved by what we're doing that they're going to kill us. What do you think they're going to do now that they know how much evidence we have to prove Walter's innocence? I had given this some thought too. Our opponents had done everything they could to frame Walter. In order to kill him, they'd lied to us and subverted the judicial process. More than a few people had told us that they'd heard angry people in the community make threats on our lives because they believed we were trying to help a guilty murderer get off death row. I don't know, I told Michael, but we have to press on, man. We have to press on. We both sat there in silence, watching the sun fade into darkness.